My father pointed toward the front door with one hand still resting on the back of his dining chair. Take your 7-year-old and leave. Don't come back. For a second, nobody moved. Christmas music was playing softly from the living room. My mother's candles were still burning between the serving dishes, and my daughter Olivia had one hand wrapped around the sleeve of my coat, like she already understood that something had just broken. Across the table, my younger sister Ashley pressed her lips together in a small smile. Then her eyes flicked past me, toward the security camera mounted near the living room doorway. That glance stopped me from saying the first thing that came into my head. I didn't argue. I didn't ask my father if he really meant it. I took Olivia's coat from the hall closet, helped her into it, picked up my purse, and reached for the blue folder sitting on the hall table. My name was printed across the tab, Jessica. Review and sign. Dad had told me earlier that it contained paperwork he wanted me to look over after dinner, so I tucked it under my arm and walked out with my daughter. 5 minutes later, while I was still driving through my parents' neighborhood, my phone rang. Dad's name appeared on the screen. I answered through the car speakers, expecting anger. Instead, his voice came out tight and frightened. Jessica, what did you take? Before I tell you what was inside that folder, I hope you're doing well today, because this was the Christmas when I finally learned the difference between a family helping you and a family deciding that their help gives them ownership over your life. Stay with me, because what I found that night changed everything I thought I knew about my parents and my sister. And if you enjoy stories about people who finally stop accepting what their families call normal, subscribe to the channel and stay with me through the end. The folder with my name on it, I said. There was a pause long enough for me to hear my tires moving over the wet winter pavement. Dad didn't ask whether Olivia was all right. He didn't ask where we were going or whether we had somewhere safe to spend the night. He asked, "Did you open it?" I looked at the folder on the passenger seat. "I'm driving. Bring it back. I'm taking Olivia home." Jessica, that folder wasn't supposed to leave the house. Then you shouldn't have put my name on it and told me I needed to review it. His breathing changed. I knew my father well enough to recognize the sound of him trying not to raise his voice. "Just bring it back tomorrow. I'll call you later." I ended the call before he could answer. Olivia had been silent in the back seat since we left. That worried me more than tears would have. At 7, she usually filled every quiet stretch of a car ride with questions, songs, observations about houses, dogs, Christmas lights, anything that crossed her mind. That night she stared through the window until the houses became darker and farther apart. Then she asked, "Grandpa meant it?" I glanced at her in the mirror. "Meant what, sweetheart?" When he said, "Don't come back." That question landed harder than anything my parents had said to me at the table. Until then, part of me had been treating the dinner like an adult conflict that Olivia would barely understand. I had been wrong. "Grandpa was angry," I said carefully. "Adults sometimes say terrible things when they're angry. But you didn't do anything wrong. And none of this is because of you. Is Grandma mad at me too?" "No." I didn't know whether Patricia was angry at Olivia. I knew she was furious with me, but I wasn't going to hand my daughter an adult interpretation she hadn't asked for. "Your job tonight is just to come home with me, get warm, and get some sleep." She nodded, but she didn't look reassured. That was when my anger changed shape. At dinner, I had been furious because my parents were trying to interfere with my move. In the car, I understood that they had made my daughter wonder whether her grandparents still wanted her. Whatever happened next, I wasn't going to treat that as another family argument everyone could pretend had never happened. The fight had started over a document Dad wanted me to sign. He had described it as routine authorization so he and Mom could still handle school pickups and ordinary medical situations whenever Olivia visited after we moved. I was relocating less than 3 hours away for a promotion I had officially accepted earlier that month. I had already signed a lease on a townhouse and started the school transfer process. Nothing about the move was impulsive. I had read the first page at the dinner table and stopped. The authorization was broader than Dad had described. It wasn't some simple emergency contact form. The wording gave my parents wide discretion over school pickup and routine decisions whenever Olivia was in their care, without clearly limiting when that care began or ended. "I'll review it at home," I'd said. Mom's expression had changed immediately. "Why?" she asked. "Your father already explained it." "Because I'm not signing something I haven't read." Ashley leaned back in her chair. It's not a mortgage, Jess. I know, Mom said. This is exactly what I've been talking about. Everything has become so difficult with you. I asked what that meant. Within minutes, the conversation wasn't about authorization anymore. It was about my promotion, my move, the school district, the drive, how often Mom would see Olivia, how much they had helped me after my husband died, and whether I was making decisions while still emotionally vulnerable. That last phrase bothered me. Not because it was cruel, because it sounded prepared. When I asked Mom not to discuss my mental state in front of Olivia, she accused me of isolating my daughter from the people who loved her. Ashley said I had become defensive about everything. Dad told me to stop turning dinner into an interrogation. Then Mom started listing incidents. Times I'd worked late. A day Olivia had missed school. A night I'd supposedly been too upset to drive safely. A disagreement over pickups. The examples came too quickly and too precisely. I remember looking from Mom to Dad and asking, "Are you keeping some kind of record on me?" Dad didn't answer. Neither did Ashley. That silence told me more than a denial would have. I stood up and said, "Olivia and I are going home." Mom accused me of proving her point. Then Dad pointed at the door. What I hadn't understood until much later was that my decision not to fight with them at the table mattered almost as much as the folder did. At the time, I only knew Ashley had looked toward the camera immediately after Dad told us to leave. I didn't know why. I just knew I didn't want to give anyone a recording of me screaming while my daughter stood beside me crying. By the time we reached home, Olivia was half asleep. I made her hot chocolate anyway, sat with her until she drank a little, and let her sleep in my bed. She asked if we still had to move. I told her yes, but only because I had chosen the new job before Christmas and because I believed the move would be good for us. I promised that nothing said at dinner had changed our plans. After she fell asleep, I carried the blue folder into the kitchen. I didn't call Mom. I didn't call Ashley. And I didn't call Dad back. That probably surprised them. In my family, I was usually the person who repaired the damage after everyone else finished causing it. If Ashley had a childcare problem, I found a solution. If Dad had insurance paperwork he didn't understand, I handled it. If Mom created a conflict and then decided Christmas or a birthday was being ruined, I was the one expected to make the first peace offering. That night, I did something different. I read. The first pages were the caregiver authorization forms Dad had shown me. I set them aside. Behind them was a printed timeline. At the top were my name and Olivia's. Underneath were dates. Beside each date was a short description. Jessica appeared emotionally unstable. Jessica demonstrated inconsistent scheduling. Jessica attempted to limit established family access to Olivia. Concern regarding increasing isolation. My hands went cold. There were screenshots of texts, printed photographs, notes about school absences, notes about nights I had worked late. Some events I recognized immediately, but the descriptions didn't match what had actually happened. One entry claimed that my schedule had left me overwhelmed by childcare. I remembered that week. Ashley had asked me to keep both of her children twice. Another said I had become unreasonably restrictive regarding school pickup. What had actually happened was that I had asked Mom to stop picking Olivia up without texting me first. Those differences mattered. I stopped reading emotionally and started reading the way I would read a problem at work. I took out my phone and photographed the cover, then every page in order. I didn't rearrange anything. I didn't write on anything. I numbered the photographs as I went so I could preserve exactly how I had received the packet. Near the back, I found a page titled Christmas. I almost skipped it. Then I noticed the wording, push relocation issue. I read the next line twice. If she becomes angry or leaves abruptly with Olivia, document reaction. The page had been prepared before dinner. In Patricia's handwriting beside the typed line were 4 words. Camera stays on throughout. I sat very still. The argument hadn't unfolded the way they had hoped. That much was suddenly obvious. They had expected me to become angry. Maybe they had expected shouting. Maybe tears. Maybe something they could point to afterward and call unstable. Instead, I'd taken my daughter and walked out. For the first time that night, Dad's panicked phone call made sense. He hadn't been afraid I'd taken a form. He was afraid I'd taken the plan. I kept turning pages until another heading stopped me. Potential evidence of parental unfitness. The first incident, listed underneath, had a date I knew immediately. I knew it because, according to my family, that was one of the nights I supposedly couldn't safely take care of my own child. And I also knew exactly whose 2 children had been staying at my house with us. I knew the date because I had spent most of that evening feeding 3 children macaroni and cheese while answering work emails from my kitchen counter. Ashley had called me shortly after lunch and said her regular sitter had canceled. She and her husband already had tickets to a concert, and she had asked if I could take the kids just for a few hours. Her 2 boys had arrived before 4 and stayed until almost 10. Olivia had been thrilled. They built a fort in my living room, watched a movie, and fell asleep in a pile of blankets while I finished a quarterly operations report at the dining table. Yet in the folder, that same date appeared under a heading about parental unfitness. According to the note, I had been overwhelmed by work demands and unable to provide Olivia with consistent individual supervision. Whoever wrote it had somehow erased the 2 extra children I had safely cared for that night. I photographed that page and kept going. The next entry concerned a Tuesday in June, when I had supposedly been emotionally dysregulated and potentially unsafe to drive. I couldn't remember anything unusual until I saw the time written beside it. Then I remembered taking Dad to his cardiology appointment because Mom hated driving downtown. She had texted me that morning asking if I could rearrange my schedule because she trusted me to make sure he asked the right questions. I had driven him there, sat through the appointment, taken notes about a medication change, and brought him home. No one had suggested I was unstable then. The description in the folder had been built around something that happened later that evening, when Mom called to complain that I hadn't immediately agreed to drive back across town and help Ashley with a broken washing machine. I had told her I was tired and wanted to stay home with Olivia. Apparently, saying no had become evidence. There were enough entries to make my stomach tighten, but not because any single one looked convincing. That was what made the file disturbing. Whoever built it understood that ordinary life could look suspicious if you stripped away everything around it. Olivia missed school because she had a fever. The folder called it attendance inconsistency. I asked Mom to text before picking Olivia up from school. The folder called it restricting established family access. I canceled a Sunday dinner because Olivia had been exhausted after a birthday party. The folder described me as withdrawing from family support. I had spent years thinking my parents remembered every favor they did for me, because that was simply how families kept track of one another. Sitting at my kitchen table after midnight, I began to wonder whether some of those memories had been stored for an entirely different reason. I opened my laptop and pulled up my calendar. I had always kept one shared family schedule because coordinating my job, Olivia's school, my parents' appointments, and Ashley's emergencies was otherwise impossible. Ashley used to tease me about it. She once told me I would schedule breathing if the calendar app allowed it. I had laughed because she wasn't entirely wrong. Now the habit she found ridiculous gave me something the folder didn't have. Context. I didn't start building a defense that night. I simply compared dates. When a note said I had been too busy to care properly for Olivia, my calendar showed Ashley's children staying with me. When another claimed I had become unreliable about family obligations, I found the dinner I had canceled because I was covering Dad's insurance appeal that weekend. The more I compared, the less the file looked like documentation, and the more it looked like a conclusion, searching for supporting details. That distinction mattered to me. I didn't want to make the opposite mistake and decide my family was guilty of some enormous plan just because I was angry. I had spent my professional life dealing with systems that failed when people started with an answer and manipulated the data until it supported them. If I was going to accuse my own parents of doing that to me, I needed more than a terrible Christmas dinner and some ugly notes. So I made a rule for myself before I continued. I would separate what I knew from what I suspected. I knew they had collected information about me. I knew at least some of it was misleading. I knew they had prepared a Christmas checklist before I arrived. I suspected Mom was behind it. I suspected Ashley had helped. I suspected Dad knew far more than he had admitted. Those suspicions were not facts yet. Olivia woke sometime after midnight and appeared in the kitchen doorway, carrying the blanket from my bed. Her hair was flattened on one side, and she looked at the papers spread across the table before looking at me. I closed the folder immediately. She asked whether I was working, and I told her I was checking some grown-up paperwork. She climbed into the chair beside me and asked if Grandma was going to call in the morning. I said I didn't know. Then she asked whether she would still be allowed to see her cousins after we moved. That question reminded me how easily adult resentment could become a child's fear. I told her moving didn't erase the people she loved, but grown-ups had to behave properly if they wanted to be part of our lives. I hadn't planned those words. Hearing myself say them made me realize I meant them. After I got Olivia back to bed, I returned to the folder and found a divider labeled Consultation. Behind it was a business card for a family law attorney and several pages of notes in Dad's handwriting. I recognized his blocky capital letters immediately. The notes weren't a letter from the attorney or any kind of legal document. They were Dad's own record of what had apparently been discussed during a consultation weeks earlier. One line said that a parent's decision to relocate within the state did not by itself establish unfitness. Another said that grandparents being heavily involved in a child's life did not automatically give them control over where that child lived. Dad had underlined one sentence twice: no current evidence of parental unfitness. I sat back and stared at it. For the first time that night, I felt something colder than anger. If my parents had gone to a lawyer because they genuinely believed Olivia was unsafe with me, I could at least understand the sequence. However insulting it was, they would have seen something, become concerned, sought advice, and started documenting afterward. But several of the notes in the folder were dated before that consultation, and they weren't written as allegations of unfitness. They were ordinary complaints about boundaries, missed dinners, pickups, and my increasing independence. Somewhere along the way, those complaints had been converted into something else. I turned the page. At the top, in Dad's handwriting, were the same words again: no current evidence of parental unfitness. Beneath them, in Mom's handwriting, was a short sentence: then we need to document it. The morning after Christmas, I woke before Olivia and made one decision before I checked a single message from my family. I called the property manager for the townhouse I had already leased and confirmed that our move-in date was still January 24th. Then I emailed the relocation coordinator at work and confirmed that I would start at the new office exactly as planned. Nobody in my family knew I was doing it, and I preferred it that way. If the purpose of that folder was to frighten me into delaying the move, I wasn't going to reward the strategy before I even understood it. My promotion had been finalized earlier that month, but the move itself had been in motion longer than my parents wanted to admit. I had toured the townhouse before accepting the position, talked with the new school district about Olivia's mid-year transfer, and built enough flexibility into my work schedule to make the transition manageable. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't sudden. The fact that my mother had started calling it an impulsive decision did not change the months of planning behind it. After breakfast, I opened Olivia's school portal and reviewed the authorized pickup list. My parents had been on it since preschool, because there had once been good reasons for that. After my husband died, Mom and Dad had been the people I called when a meeting ran late or Olivia woke up sick on a morning I couldn't immediately leave work. I wasn't going to pretend those years of help had never happened, but I also wasn't going to leave unrestricted access in place while I was staring at a folder titled Potential Evidence of Parental Unfitness. I removed Mom and Dad from automatic pickup authorization and added my friend Lauren as the local emergency backup until the move. Then I sent the school office a short message stating that only the people currently listed were authorized to pick Olivia up and that any future changes had to come directly from me. I didn't tell them my parents were dangerous. I didn't mention the folder. I wasn't interested in creating drama where none was needed. I was simply closing a door that had been left open because trust used to make it unnecessary to lock. Ashley called before noon. I watched her name flash across my screen twice before I answered, partly because I wanted to know what version of Christmas she had already accepted as the truth. She skipped hello and went straight to, "Mom's been crying all morning." I told her I was sorry Mom was upset. Ashley said, "You know she's terrified you're taking Olivia away from everyone." I reminded her that moving less than 3 hours away was not taking a child away from anyone. "That's easy for you to say," she replied. "You're the one leaving." I asked what she meant by that. Ashley exhaled loudly. "Everything is going to be harder. Mom can't just pick Olivia up anymore. Dad can't help if something happens. And what am I supposed to do when my sitter cancels? You know I don't have anyone else nearby who can take both boys." There it was. Not a confession. Not proof of anything. Just a sentence I couldn't stop hearing once she'd said it. I thought we were talking about Olivia, I said. We are. I'm saying the whole family works because we're close. I looked across the kitchen at Olivia, coloring at the table, and chose my words carefully. A system that only works if I never move isn't a system I agreed to. Ashley became defensive immediately. She told me I was twisting her words, accused me of punishing everyone over one bad dinner, and said I had no idea how much Mom had sacrificed for me. I didn't argue about any of it. I just said I wasn't changing the move date and ended the call when she started talking over me. Dad tried a different approach an hour later. He didn't mention Christmas until several minutes into the conversation. Instead, he talked about practicality. 3 hours was too far if Olivia got sick at school. Mom hated driving on highways. He had medical appointments every few months. Ashley already had 2 children to manage. What if I had an emergency at work? What if I needed help? I'll make arrangements, I said. You already have arrangements here. That's not the same thing. It has worked for years. That sentence stayed with me because Dad sounded genuinely confused. He wasn't threatening me. He was describing the existing family structure as if its continuation were self-evidently reasonable. I had been the backup driver, the paperwork person, the emergency babysitter, the daughter who understood insurance forms, online portals, school emails, and appointment schedules. Whenever something broke, everyone called me because I usually knew how to fix it. I had always considered that competence one of my strengths. For the first time, I wondered whether I had made myself too available. That didn't excuse what they had done. I wasn't going to turn their choices into my fault because I had helped too often. But I could admit something uncomfortable about myself without absolving them. I liked solving problems. I liked being the person who could handle things. Sometimes I stepped in before anyone else had to experience the inconvenience of fixing their own mess. And over time, everyone had stopped treating my help as a favor. Mom didn't call. She sent an email. It was almost 2 pages long. She began with the week my husband died. She reminded me that she had slept on my couch for 12 nights. She listed the preschool pickups, the dinners she cooked, the appointments she attended with me, the Christmas she had decorated my house because I couldn't bring myself to open the storage boxes. She remembered details I had forgotten, and for several minutes I couldn't read the message without crying. Then the tone shifted. After everything we did, she wrote, she could not understand how I could now make a decision that removed Olivia from the family that raised her. That sentence dried my tears. My parents had helped raise Olivia. I would never deny that. But there was a difference between participating in a child's life and acquiring ownership of the decisions around that child. Mom's email read like a ledger in which every act of love had quietly accumulated interest. Olivia wandered into the room while I was still staring at the screen. She asked if Grandma was angry because we were moving, and I told her Grandma had strong feelings about it. Then Olivia asked, if we don't move, will everybody stop being mad? I closed the laptop. That was the moment I understood how badly I had underestimated what Christmas had done to her. I had been so focused on protecting her from the argument that I hadn't realized she was trying to solve it. 7-year-olds are very good at deciding adults' emotions must somehow be their responsibility. We are not changing our home because people are mad, I told her. And you don't have to fix grown-up feelings. That's our job. She looked relieved enough that I wished I had said it sooner. When she went back to her toys, I opened the family calendar on my laptop. I wasn't trying to prove my mother wrong anymore. I was trying to establish what I actually knew. I chose one allegation from the folder and searched the date. May 14th. The dossier said I had been overloaded with work and unable to give Olivia consistent supervision. My calendar said something very different. 3:30. Ashley drops boys at my house. 4:15. Snack. 6. Dinner. 7:30. Movie. 9:15. Ashley pickup. I searched my texts and found Ashley's message from that afternoon, thanking me for saving her plans. She had even written, I owe you. The boys are safer with you than anybody. I sat there looking at the contradiction for a long time. Then I checked another date, June 2nd. The folder said I had been emotionally unstable and potentially unsafe to drive Olivia. I didn't need the calendar to remember that morning. Mom had called before 8 because Dad had a cardiology appointment downtown and she didn't want to drive on the interstate. She had asked me to take him because, in her exact words, I was the only person she trusted to make sure he understood what the doctor said. I opened my messages and searched the date. Mom's text was still there. "Can you take Dad today? I trust you to handle this better than anyone." I read it twice, then looked back at the accusation in the folder. For the first time since Christmas dinner, I wasn't wondering whether my family had misunderstood me. I was wondering how many times they had trusted me privately while documenting me as unstable on paper. By the next morning, I had stopped thinking about the folder as one ugly accusation after another. I needed to know whether the pattern held up when I removed my family's interpretation and looked only at dates, messages, school notices, and my own work schedule. That was something I knew how to do. At work, when 3 departments told 3 different versions of why a shipment failed, I didn't pick the person I trusted most. I rebuilt the sequence. So I opened a blank spreadsheet, put the dates from my parents' dossier down one side, and started matching each one to records I already legally had. May 14th was the easiest place to begin because Ashley had handed me the contradiction herself months earlier. The dossier described me as overwhelmed by work and unable to supervise Olivia consistently. My calendar showed Ashley's boys arriving at 3:30 and leaving after 9. My work schedule showed that I had been working from home. Then, I found the text Ashley sent me after I agreed to take them. "You're saving my life. I don't know what I'd do without you tonight." 40 minutes later, she had sent another message asking whether the boys had eaten. I had answered that all 3 kids had finished dinner and were building a fort in the living room. She had replied with a heart and told me I was the only person she trusted when her sitter canceled at the last minute. I saved the messages with the date visible and added them to my timeline. I wasn't interested in making them look more dramatic than they were. In fact, that was the point. There was nothing dramatic about May 14th until someone removed Ashley's children from the story and turned an ordinary night into evidence that I couldn't manage my own daughter. If Ashley had genuinely believed I was unsafe or overwhelmed around children that night, she had a strange way of showing it. She had left me with 2 more. June 2nd was even cleaner. Mom's morning text was exactly where I remembered it. She had asked me to take Dad to cardiology because she hated driving downtown and wanted someone who would listen closely to the doctor. "You're the only person I trust to make sure everything gets handled," she had written. I had picked Dad up, driven him to the appointment, taken notes about a medication adjustment, stopped at the pharmacy with him, and brought him home. The dossier later described me that same day as emotionally unstable and potentially unsafe to drive Olivia. The accusation wasn't completely invented. That evening, Mom and I had argued after I refused to drive across town again to deal with Ashley's broken washing machine. I had been tired and irritated. Apparently, in their version, my irritation existed while everything that had happened before it vanished. I kept going. Not every entry collapsed so easily. Some were opinions, some described moments I remembered differently but couldn't independently prove. I marked those separately instead of pretending every accusation was false. That mattered to me. If I wanted the truth to protect me, I couldn't start editing it whenever it became inconvenient. By lunch, the strongest part of my timeline wasn't the number of accusations I could challenge. It was how often my family's own behavior contradicted the labels they had attached to me. I wanted one thing that didn't depend on my calendar alone. I could already imagine Ashley saying I had entered the wrong childcare dates months ago, or that I was remembering things selectively. Confronting her would only warn her what I had found. So I sent a message that sounded exactly like the kind of boring administrative question she expected from me. "I'm updating my records before the move. Can you send me the dates I watched the boys this year? I don't want to miss anything." She answered 20 minutes later. "Seriously? Of course you're making a record of this." Then she added a laughing face and said she would look through her calendar. I didn't respond to the joke. An hour later, she sent a list. It was longer than I expected. Some dates were short pickups, others were evenings. A few were the regular weekly help I had agreed to. Then I saw May 14th. Ashley had confirmed it herself. At the bottom, she wrote, "You always keep better records than I do. I probably forgot a couple." I stared at that line for a while. She still thought my habit of recording details was mildly ridiculous. She had no idea that the same habit was showing me exactly how careless their story had been. I saved her message and closed the laptop when I realized Olivia had been standing near the kitchen doorway for several seconds. She was dressed, except for one sock, and holding her school bag against her chest. I asked if she needed help finding something. She shook her head. Then she said, "Mom, are you a bad mom?" Every thought about timelines disappeared. I crouched in front of her. "Why would you ask me that?" She looked down at the zipper on her bag. "Grandma said you're taking me away from everybody. And Aunt Ashley said you don't know what's best because you're mad." I felt a sharp rush of anger, mostly at myself. I had been so busy making sure no adult could twist the facts that I had missed what those adults had already put inside my daughter's head. "I'm not a bad mom because we're moving," I told her. "And you're not doing anything wrong by coming with me." Adults can disagree. Adults can even be angry. But it is never your job to decide which adult is right or make everyone happy. Will Grandma still love me? That's something Grandma is responsible for showing you. You don't have to earn it by staying where she wants. Olivia thought about that, then asked if she could take the stuffed rabbit her grandparents had given her to the new house. I told her of course she could. I helped her find the missing sock, packed her lunch, and didn't reopen the spreadsheet until after she left for the day. That conversation changed one part of my plan. I had been treating the folder like a problem I could solve through organization. Olivia reminded me that I wasn't only protecting a record. I was protecting the environment she had to grow up inside. Even if every accusation disappeared tomorrow, I couldn't go back to pretending that unrestricted access was harmless while my mother and sister were discussing my fitness as a parent around my 7-year-old. That afternoon, I finished copying the folder. I photographed every page in order, backed the images up, and saved the pages that directly concerned me and Olivia. I didn't alter anything. I didn't keep the originals longer than necessary. Then I packed the entire paper folder into a mailing envelope and sent it back to Dad using tracked delivery. I kept the receipt with my records. He texted me that evening after the tracking showed it had arrived. "Thank you." That was all. Mom said nothing. For the first time since Christmas, I almost believed I had bought myself a little quiet. The move was still scheduled. Olivia was safe. The folder was back in my parents' possession. I had enough copies to protect myself if they tried to rewrite what had been inside it, and Ashley had unknowingly confirmed one of the strongest contradictions. Then an email appeared in my inbox 2 days later. The subject line referenced a concern involving Olivia. I read the first paragraph once, then again more slowly. Someone wanted to speak with me about questions that had been raised regarding my daughter's welfare and the stability of our home during my upcoming relocation. I still didn't know who had contacted them. Then I reached the phrase describing me. Increasing emotional instability. My stomach tightened. I had seen those exact 3 words before. They were in the folder. The email did not say I was under investigation, and it did not say anyone had decided Olivia was unsafe. It said a concern had been received and that someone wanted to speak with me about our household, my upcoming relocation, and several statements regarding my emotional stability. I read it 3 times before I let myself react. The phrase from the folder was frightening, but fear was not evidence. I still didn't know who had contacted them, what exactly had been said, or whether the person reviewing the concern had seen anything beyond an allegation. So instead of calling my mother and demanding answers, I wrote down the questions I needed answered and called the number in the email. The woman I spoke with introduced herself, explained the basic purpose of the contact, and made it clear that she was gathering information rather than accusing me of anything. That distinction helped. She asked about Olivia's school, our current home, my work schedule, the move, the support system I planned to have after relocation, and whether there had been any recent crisis in our household. I answered directly. I told her my husband had died 4 years earlier, that my parents had helped us significantly afterward, and that our relationship had deteriorated after I accepted a promotion and decided to move. I did not say my family was trying to steal my daughter. I did not call them abusive. I told her there had been a Christmas conflict and that I had recently discovered my parents had been collecting notes about my parenting. When she asked whether I believed someone in my family had made the report, I said, "I don't know." That was the truth. I wanted it to be Mom because it fit what I had already seen. Ashley had helped collect information. Dad had organized the folder. Any one of them could have made the contact, or they could have discussed it and let someone else do it. I wasn't going to ruin my own credibility by pretending suspicion was knowledge. The questions themselves were less frightening than the wording behind them. Someone had described me as increasingly isolated from family support. Someone had raised concern about inconsistent school attendance. Someone had said I had demonstrated emotional instability during the period surrounding my relocation decision. I didn't receive a copy of anyone's report, and I wasn't told who had submitted it. But as the woman summarized the concerns, I recognized phrases from the packet almost word for word. I asked if I could provide records that gave context to certain dates. She said yes. That afternoon, I sent only what was relevant. Olivia's school attendance record showed a handful of ordinary absences, most connected to illness. I provided the communication from the school for the days I had kept her home. I included my signed lease for the new townhouse, confirmation of the transfer process with her new school district, and my employment letter showing the promotion had been planned rather than sudden. I also sent a concise timeline for the dates specifically mentioned during the call. I did not send 200 screenshots and bury the person in family drama. If a claim said I had been unable to manage childcare on May 14th, I provided the message showing Ashley had left both her sons with me that evening. If a concern referenced my ability to drive on June 2nd, I provided Mom's own request that I drive Dad to cardiology that morning. There was one thing I deliberately did not send. Dad's notes from his legal consultation. Those notes told me something important about my parents' thinking, but they were Dad's private record of a conversation with an attorney. I had copied them because they had been included in a packet labeled for my review, but I wasn't interested in testing whether they belonged in an official process. I didn't need them. The factual contradictions were stronger because they came from ordinary records no one could argue I had misunderstood. The woman also asked whether Olivia had been exposed to any of the conflict. I hated that question because the answer was yes. I told her what had happened at Christmas and that Olivia had heard my father tell us to leave. I also told her Olivia had later repeated comments about me taking her away from the family. I did not minimize it to make myself look better. I admitted that I had initially underestimated how much she understood. Then I explained what I had done afterward. Remove disputed pickup access. Stopped discussing the conflict around her. Kept the move on its original schedule. And made sure she understood that adult disagreements were not hers to fix. Talking about it out loud made me realize something I hadn't wanted to admit. My parents had spent years presenting themselves as my support system, and until Christmas, I had assumed more access automatically meant more security for Olivia. But access without boundaries was not security. It was simply access. Later that day, I scheduled a consultation with a family law attorney of my own. I wasn't preparing for a custody battle, and the attorney did not tell me one was inevitable. In fact, the first thing she did was strip away most of the catastrophic scenarios I had been imagining. She told me to separate legal reality from family threats. I was Olivia's parent. I had stable housing, stable employment, a school plan, and no history suggesting she was unsafe in my care. A relative disliking my relocation did not automatically create authority over that decision. What mattered, she said, was that I stay boring. No angry public posts. No threatening texts. No attempts to make Olivia choose sides. No long arguments about who had done more for whom. Keep records. Answer legitimate questions. Follow normal school procedures. Move when I had planned to move, unless something real required me to change course. It was almost funny how relieved I felt hearing someone tell me to be boring. My family had spent Christmas trying to turn me into a dramatic story. The smartest thing I could do was refuse the role. Mom tested that resolve that evening. She sent me a message that began, "I don't know how we got here." Then came photographs. Olivia as a toddler asleep on Dad's chest. Mom holding her at a pumpkin patch. Ashley and me with all 3 children at a summer barbecue. The last photo was from the Christmas after my husband died. I looked exhausted. Mom had one arm around me and one around Olivia. Her message underneath read, "We were there when you had nobody. I hope someday you remember that." I stared at it longer than I should have. That was Mom's strongest weapon, because it was built around something true. They had been there. There were nights after my husband's death when I would not have known how to get through the next morning without them. Mom had packed Olivia's lunches. Dad had changed a broken lock at my house. Ashley had slept over when I couldn't stand being alone. I could appreciate every one of those things and still refuse to let them control where I lived 4 years later. So I didn't argue with the photographs. I wrote, "I remember what you did for us. I also remember what happened on Christmas. I am not discussing Olivia's relocation with you while you are collecting material about my parenting." Mom replied almost immediately, "We were concerned because you changed." I typed several responses and deleted all of them. Finally, I wrote, "Then communicate any genuine concern directly and accurately." She did not answer. The next contact about the welfare concern came a few days later. There was no dramatic visit, no one threatening to remove Olivia, and no official declaration that I had won anything. I was told there was no indication of an immediate safety issue, and that the information I had provided would be reviewed as part of the assessment. That was all. It was enough to let me breathe, but not enough to pretend the problem was over. I continued packing. Olivia helped choose which books would go in the first box for her new room. I kept working. I confirmed utilities. I completed school transfer forms. Every ordinary task felt like an act of defiance because my parents had apparently expected fear to interrupt the move, and it hadn't. Then my cousin Lauren called me. She sounded uncomfortable before she even explained why. "Aunt Patricia has been talking to people," she said. "She's telling everyone you're moving Olivia because you're unstable, and that there are people looking into whether you should even be making decisions for her right now." I closed my eyes. Lauren continued. "She said you might lose custody if you keep pushing this." That sentence didn't frighten me the way Mom probably intended it to. It made something click. The private concern had not been enough for her. She needed a family audience too. And if she was already telling relatives that I might lose my daughter before any assessment had reached that conclusion, then Patricia wasn't describing a result. She was selling a story she had decided on in advance. I kept staring at my mother's handwriting beside the sentence Dad had copied from the attorney's advice. "No evidence of parental unfitness based on facts provided." Beneath it, Patricia had written, "Then we need to document it." What bothered me wasn't that the sentence sounded sinister by itself. If someone genuinely believed a child was in danger, keeping accurate records would be reasonable. The problem was everything around it. Dad's notes said the attorney had explained that my relocation, my job, and my parents' involvement with Olivia did not give them control over where a fit parent chose to live. He had also written that if genuine safety concerns arose, they should document those concerns accurately. Nothing in his notes said they should search backward through my life and reinterpret ordinary disagreements as evidence. I reopened the copies of the folder and sorted the entries by the dates on which the events had actually happened, then separately by when they appeared to have been assembled into the formal section labeled parental unfitness. That distinction changed everything. Mom had kept complaints before the consultation. She had notes about school pickups, Sunday dinners I canceled, work calls, and times I told her I wanted more notice before she made plans involving Olivia. They were grievances. They were intrusive, but they weren't originally framed as proof that I was an unsafe mother. After the consultation, the language changed. The same old events came back under new headings such as instability, isolation, inconsistent supervision, and impaired judgment, and new entries began appearing much more frequently. I sat back from my laptop and looked at the timeline. The simplest explanation was no longer that my mother had become frightened after noticing a pattern in my parenting. The pattern had been constructed after she learned that ordinary family involvement wasn't enough to give her power over my move. I still couldn't prove every intention behind it, and I wasn't going to pretend one handwritten sentence could tell me everything inside her head. But I could prove sequence. There had been complaints first, legal disappointment second, and an unfitness dossier third. That sequence mattered. I also knew confronting all three of them together would be stupid. If I called a family meeting and announced what I had found, they would have time to settle on one story before I knew which parts each person actually owned. So I did something much less satisfying and much more useful. I emailed Dad a single question. "Who asked you to put the material behind the authorization packet?" I didn't accuse him of creating the dossier. I didn't mention Mom's handwritten note. I simply waited. His reply came that evening. I only organized what your mother already had. I didn't write those accusations, Jessica. He followed it with a paragraph about how he had been trying to keep things orderly because Mom had collected papers in several places and wanted them together before Christmas. Most of the paragraph was self-defense. I didn't argue with it. The first sentence was enough. Dad had just confirmed that the material had come to him through Mom and that his role had been organizing it. I saved the email and moved to Ashley, but I was even more careful with her. I didn't ask whether she had helped build a case against me. I asked why some of her screenshots and photographs had ended up in Mom's file. Ashley took almost an hour to answer. When she did, she said, Mom asked if I still had texts and pictures from a few specific days. She said she needed a record in case you cut everyone off from Olivia after the move. Then, as if she realized how bad that sounded, she added, I thought it was just family leverage, Jess. I didn't think any of it was going outside the family. I read that sentence several times. It did not tell me who had contacted child welfare. Ashley didn't know, or at least she wasn't admitting that she knew. I wasn't going to make the mistake of turning her uncertainty into my certainty. But she had admitted something important anyway. She knew Mom was building a record designed to pressure me, and she had supplied material for it. Whether Ashley understood every possible consequence did not change the fact that she had helped create the weapon. Olivia came into the kitchen while I was saving the message. She was carrying 2 cardboard boxes and had written "new room" on both in purple marker. She asked whether she could pack her stuffed animals herself because she wanted to decide which one would be the first toy on her new bed. I told her yes, and for the next 20 minutes, we sat on the floor deciding which animals could survive the journey inside a box and which absolutely had to ride in the car with us. Watching her argue that a stuffed rabbit might get lonely in the dark was a useful reminder that my life was still happening outside the dossier. When Olivia went back upstairs, I sent Mom one email. I didn't tell her what Dad or Ashley had said. I wrote, Why were Ashley's screenshots and photographs included in the file about my parenting? Mom replied faster than either of them had. Her answer began with several sentences about how everyone had been concerned and how I was trying to divide the family by asking questions individually. Then she wrote, Ashley sent me things because your father wouldn't take my concerns seriously at first. Someone had to pay attention before you moved Olivia away and made this permanent. I felt a strange calm when I read it. Mom was trying to blame Dad for failing to act quickly enough, but in doing so, she had answered my question better than I expected. Dad hadn't started the collection. Ashley hadn't independently approached my parents with fears about Olivia. Mom had asked Ashley for material because Dad initially wasn't taking her concerns seriously. Then Dad had eventually organized what Mom collected. I placed the 3 responses side by side. Mom initiated, Ashley supplied, Dad organized. None of them had done everything, which I realized was exactly why each of them could probably tell themselves they hadn't done anything unforgivable. Dad could say he hadn't written the accusations. Ashley could say she hadn't created the file. Mom could say other people had contributed, so her concerns must have been shared. Responsibility had been divided into pieces small enough for each person to carry without admitting what the completed structure looked like. A year earlier, I probably would have called them immediately. I would have demanded explanations until somebody cried, somebody apologized halfway, and Dad told me we had all said things we regretted. Then I would have been expected to help repair the damage. That was the family rhythm I knew. But by then, I understood that knowing when not to act was sometimes as important as acting. I saved everything, continued preparing for the move, and gave none of them a reason to know how much their individual explanations had revealed. A few days later, I received an update regarding the child welfare concern. The assessment was still being processed, but the information reviewed so far had not identified an immediate safety issue in my home or with Olivia's care. I read that sentence slowly and felt some of the pressure leave my chest. It wasn't a final closure, and I knew better than to treat it like one. But the worst thing my imagination had been doing to me since the first contact had finally lost some of its power. I didn't celebrate. I packed dishes. That evening, Olivia sat on the kitchen counter, wrapping mugs in newspaper while I taped boxes shut. She asked whether the new house would smell different from ours, and whether she would be allowed to paint her room someday. We talked about curtains and bookshelves in the park near the townhouse. For almost an hour, my family did not enter the conversation. That felt healthier than any victory speech could have. Then my phone started vibrating across the counter. It wasn't Mom, Dad, or Ashley. It was the extended family group chat, which had been mostly quiet since Christmas. Patricia had sent a long message to everyone. She said the situation had become too serious for private conversations and that the family needed to come together before I made an irreversible mistake. She wanted everyone at my parents' house that weekend for what she called a family meeting. Her last line read, "We need to talk before Jessica takes Olivia away for good." I looked at the boxes stacked beside my front door, then at the calendar showing our move date less than 2 weeks away. My first instinct was to refuse. Then I thought about the story Mom had already been telling relatives, the dossier, the report language, and the 3 admissions now sitting safely in my records. I typed one sentence into the group chat. "I'll be there." Then I added the part that mattered most. "Olivia won't." Ashley asked to see me alone 2 days after I agreed to the family meeting. She suggested a coffee shop halfway between our houses, but I didn't want to spend the conversation wondering who might be listening from the next table. I told her she could come to my place after Olivia left with Lauren for the afternoon. By then, most of our living room was already packed into cardboard boxes, and I remember thinking the room looked strangely appropriate for the conversation. Half my life was sealed up and ready to leave, while my sister stood in the middle of it trying to explain why she had helped people build a case designed to keep me exactly where I was. Ashley didn't sit down immediately. She looked at the boxes, then at the bare spot on the wall where family photographs had been hanging a week earlier. "Mom said you were serious about moving," she said. I told her I had been serious from the beginning. She gave me a tired look and said that wasn't what she meant. "I thought after Christmas you'd cool down. I thought you'd realize this was getting out of control." I almost laughed at the wording. This got out of control before I knew it existed. She sat on the edge of my couch and rubbed both hands over her jeans. I didn't know she was going to take it this far. I stayed across from her instead of sitting beside her. "What did you think she was going to do?" Ashley hesitated. That pause mattered because, for once, I wasn't going to rescue her from it by offering possible answers. Eventually, she said Mom had told her the folder was supposed to protect their access to Olivia if I moved and suddenly stopped letting anyone see her. Patricia had described it as leverage, not a custody case. According to Ashley, Mom kept saying that grandparents who had been involved for years shouldn't be powerless if their daughter decided to cut them off. "And you believed I was planning to cut everyone off?" I asked. Ashley looked away. "You were already limiting pickups. I asked Mom to text me before picking up my child. You are changing things." "Yes, because I'm her mother." Ashley flinched, and for a second I saw the same younger sister who used to cry whenever our parents made us choose sides. That feeling passed quickly. Childhood memories did not erase adult choices. I asked her exactly what she had given Mom. Ashley admitted she had sent screenshots of our texts, several photographs, and her recollection of a few days when I had been stressed or late. She also admitted that Mom sometimes asked questions in a way that pushed her toward a particular description. She'd say, "Wasn't Jessica really overwhelmed that week?" And I'd say yes. Or she'd ask if Olivia looked tired when you picked her up, and sometimes she did. "Did you ever tell her that your boys were at my house on some of those days?" Ashley stared at the floor. "Did you?" "No." "Did you ever tell her that some of those nights I was late because I was helping you?" "No." "Then you weren't just giving her information." She raised her head. "I didn't make anything up. You removed the parts that changed what it meant." Ashley opened her mouth, then closed it again. I let the silence sit there. Finally, she said, "I know that now." "No, you knew it then. You may not have known what Mom was going to do with it, but you knew the version you were giving her made me look worse than the truth." Her face tightened. "I didn't think anyone outside the family would ever see it." That was the sentence she kept coming back to, as if privacy would have made the lie harmless. I told her the problem wasn't that an outsider might see it. The problem was that she had helped create it in the first place. "You didn't have to know every consequence to know you were lying about me." Ashley started crying then, quietly and angrily. the way she always had when she wanted to keep talking but hated what she was hearing. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. There was a time when seeing her cry would have made me soften my point until she could live with it. That afternoon, I handed her a tissue and waited. After a while, she said, "Do you know what happens when you leave?" "I move." "No, Jess, to everybody else." I almost stopped her because I assumed another speech about Mom was coming. Instead, she surprised me. Ashley talked about her own schedule, daycare, the boys, her husband's shifts, and all the small emergencies I had absorbed for years. She admitted that when I told everyone about the promotion, the first thing she thought about wasn't Olivia. It was how many times a month she called me because something had gone wrong. "I know how that sounds," she said. "It sounds honest." She gave a bitter laugh. "You always get to be the one who can leave." That sentence finally showed me the part of Ashley's resentment I had only suspected before. She wasn't merely afraid of losing free childcare. She was angry that I had built a life with options. After my husband died, everyone had expected me to be the one who needed rescuing. Instead, over the years, I had stabilized. I advanced at work, I handled my bills, I raised Olivia. Ashley had 2 children, a marriage that required constant scheduling, and a life that seemed to generate emergencies faster than she could solve them. She depended on me, and somewhere inside that dependence, gratitude had curdled into resentment. "I didn't get to leave anything," I told her. "I built something after losing my husband. There's a difference." "I know. Do you?" She wiped her face. "I hated that you could say yes to the new job. I hated that you didn't have to ask anybody if you were allowed to go. I kept thinking you would leave and everything here would get harder, and you'd just start over somewhere else. That was cruel, but at least it was real." I told her something I had only recently admitted to myself. I had made it too easy for everyone to depend on me. I said yes too often. I changed my schedule instead of letting Ashley solve her own childcare problems. I handled Dad's paperwork because it was faster than teaching him. I stepped into Mom's emergencies because I liked being competent, and because helping made me feel useful after years when grief had made me feel useless. Ashley looked almost relieved. "So you understand." "I understand my part," I said. "My part was saying yes too often. Your part was deciding my yes belonged to you." Her relief disappeared. I wasn't blaming myself for the dossier. I wasn't giving her a way to say we had both made mistakes and call it even. I was naming the flaw that had helped create the family system while keeping responsibility for the betrayal exactly where it belonged. Ashley was quiet for several minutes before she asked whether I had seen the full Christmas video. I told her I had only seen the short clip Kenneth had apparently shown relatives, the one that started after Dad told us to leave. Ashley frowned and said Dad had kept the entire recording because, at first, he thought it proved I had stormed out for no reason. She didn't have access to his security account, and I didn't ask for it. Then she mentioned that he had sent a longer clip to our Uncle Daniel after Daniel questioned whether the dinner had really happened the way Dad described. I asked how much longer. "I don't know. A few minutes, maybe. Enough to show before you left." That information went into the same mental category as everything else I had learned. Useful, but not yet evidence in my hands. I wasn't going to break into Dad's account, guess passwords, or ask Ashley to steal anything. If Daniel still had the clip Kenneth had voluntarily sent him, that was different. Ashley stood to leave, but she stopped near the front door. "Jess, whatever happens at the family meeting, can you leave Mom out of the report stuff?" I stared at her. She rushed to explain. "I'm not saying she did nothing. I'm saying you don't know she made the report. None of us know that. And if Dad organized the file, and I gave her things, then maybe just deal with what each person actually did." For a second, I thought she had finally understood what I had been doing all along. Then she added, "If you go after Mom, she'll destroy the whole family trying to defend herself." There it was. The old assignment. Protect Mom from consequences, because Mom's reaction would be exhausting for everyone else. I shook my head. I'm not accusing her of submitting something I can't prove she submitted. Ashley looked relieved. But I'm also not leaving her out of what I can prove. Her shoulders dropped. I am not protecting one of you from the consequences of the other anymore. Dad gets responsibility for what Dad did. You get responsibility for what you did. Mom gets responsibility for what she did. Nobody gets to hand me the cleanup. Ashley looked like she wanted to argue, but there wasn't much left to argue about. She put on her coat and left without asking me to reconsider the move. That was probably the first conversation we'd had in years where neither of us ended by promising to fix something for the other. After she left, I called Uncle Daniel. I didn't tell him what Ashley had said about the video. I simply asked whether Dad had ever sent him footage from Christmas dinner. He hesitated, then said yes. Dad had sent a longer clip because Daniel had questioned why the story everyone heard seemed to begin with me already leaving. "Do you still have it?" I asked. "I think so. If Dad sent it to you voluntarily, would you forward me the exact file he sent?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Jessica, I don't want to be in the middle of this. Neither do I. That's why I'm only asking for something Dad already chose to send you." A few minutes later, the file arrived. I waited until Olivia was still out with Lauren before I opened it. The timestamp showed several minutes before I had entered the room. Mom was near the dining table. Dad was adjusting something near the doorway. Ashley's voice came from off camera. "What if she just leaves?" Mom answered first. "If she starts yelling, let her finish." Then Dad's voice came through clearly. Nobody turned that camera off. I stopped the video. For weeks, my family had described Christmas as the night I suddenly became unreasonable. Now I was listening to them prepare for my reaction before I had even walked into the room. The confirmation came on a Wednesday morning while I was standing in the kitchen wrapping plates in newspaper. The concern involving Olivia had been closed. The woman who contacted me explained that the information reviewed had not established an immediate or ongoing safety issue consistent with the allegations that had been raised. She didn't tell me who had submitted the concern, and I didn't ask again. By then, I understood that knowing the reporter's identity would not change the records in front of me. What mattered was that I had cooperated, provided accurate information, and the process had ended without supporting the picture my family's dossier had tried to create. I sat down after the call and stayed there for several minutes with a roll of packing tape in my hand. I had imagined feeling victorious if the concern closed. Instead, I mostly felt tired. For weeks, ordinary parts of my life had been turned into questions I was expected to answer. Whether Olivia went to school consistently, whether my work interfered with parenting, whether moving was evidence of instability, whether limiting my mother's access meant I was isolating my daughter. I called the attorney I had consulted and gave her the update. When she told me that was good news, I said, "Good. I can stop proving I'm her mother and get back to being her mother." Saying it out loud made me realize how much time the entire situation had already taken from the life I was supposedly being judged for managing badly. That afternoon, Olivia came home with a paper snowflake she'd made at school and announced that it had to go in her new bedroom window. We taped it carefully between two pieces of cardboard so it wouldn't bend during the move. She talked about whether she wanted her desk near the window or beside the bookshelf, and I let the conversation stay there. I didn't tell her the concern had been closed because she had never needed to carry the fear that came with it in the first place. She knew adults were arguing. She knew Christmas had been awful. She did not need to know that strangers had briefly been asked to evaluate whether her home was safe. After Olivia went to bed, I watched the Christmas video Uncle Daniel had forwarded me. I had stopped it the first time after hearing Dad say nobody should turn the camera off. This time, I watched the entire section he had received. The camera was mounted openly near the living room doorway. Everyone in our family knew it was there because Dad used the same system to watch the front porch and hall when they traveled. I wasn't treating the recording like courtroom evidence. I wanted to know what had happened before I entered the room and whether the short clip my parents had shown relatives had removed anything important. It had. Ashley could be heard asking, "What if she just leaves?" Mom told her that if I started yelling, nobody should interrupt me. Dad told them not to turn off the camera. A little later, after some discussion about the paperwork, Dad said that if I left with Olivia, they would make a note of that too. No one said they were going to frame me. No one used the word custody. That would have been too convenient and, frankly, less believable. What the recording showed was simpler. Before I ever walked into Christmas dinner, They had already decided that my reaction would become information. That distinction mattered. I wasn't going into the family meeting claiming the video proved every intention behind the dossier. It didn't. It proved that the dinner had not been an ordinary disagreement that suddenly made everyone concerned about me. They had been prepared to observe and document specific behaviors before the conflict began. Combined with the Christmas checklist, that was enough. I spent the next evening deciding what I would bring to the meeting. My first impulse was everything. I had screenshots, calendar entries, Dad's emails, Ashley's messages, Mom's email, the Christmas checklist, Dad's personal consultation notes, the longer video, school records, and the confirmation that the concern had been closed. Then I imagined placing all of it across my parents' coffee table while 10 people argued over individual details. Mom would dispute wording. Ashley would say she didn't remember. Dad would get lost in dates. Within 20 minutes, the truth would be buried under the volume of evidence meant to prove it. So I cut the pile down. May 14th. Ashley described me as overwhelmed and unsafe while both of her sons were in my care. June 2nd. Mom described me as unstable to drive while asking me that same morning to drive Dad to cardiology because I was the person she trusted to handle it. Christmas. Mom said my behavior that night justified their concern, yet they had prepared a checklist about documenting my reaction before I arrived. 3 contradictions. That was enough to establish the pattern. The camera would support the third. Dad's personal notes from the legal consultation would show what happened between their frustration and the creation of the unfitness dossier. Everything else could stay in my files unless someone tried to deny a specific fact. Patricia sent me a message the next morning. She wanted Olivia at the meeting. "This is about her," Mom wrote. "She has a right to hear that everyone loves her." I read the message once and answered in writing so there would be nothing to reinterpret later. Olivia will not attend. Adults discussing my parenting, custody, access, or the move will do so without her present. Mom responded that I was proving I wanted to control everything Olivia heard. I didn't answer. That was one of the strangest changes in me during those weeks. Before Christmas, silence had often felt rude. If Mom sent 6 paragraphs, I felt obligated to send 6 paragraphs back. If Ashley misunderstood something, I explained until she admitted she understood. If Dad said everyone needed to calm down, I tried to identify which sentence had upset which person and fix it. Once I stopped believing every accusation required a defense, my phone became much quieter. Lauren agreed to keep Olivia during the meeting. I told Olivia I had to have a grown-up conversation with Grandma and Grandpa before the move. She asked whether she had done anything wrong. I told her no, and because I had learned from the way she questioned me after Christmas, I added something more specific. "You are not staying away because anyone is angry with you. You're staying with Lauren because this is an adult problem and adults need to handle it." She nodded and asked whether Lauren would let her make pancakes for dinner. I said that was between her and Lauren. Dad called me that evening. His voice was softer than it had been since Christmas. He said Mom had invited a few relatives because she believed everyone needed to understand the situation before I made a permanent decision. I reminded him the decision was already made. He sighed and said, "If you don't come, she'll make this bigger." There was a time when that sentence would have worked immediately. Mom becoming more upset had always been treated like a weather emergency. Everyone adjusted plans before the storm arrived. "I'm coming," I said. Dad sounded relieved. "Good. Then maybe we can settle this. I'm not coming to ask whether I'm allowed to move." He went quiet. "I'm coming because Mom has involved other people in a false story about me. I'm going to correct that story. Then I'm going to explain what happens next. Jessica, don't go in there looking for a fight. I'm not. And I meant it. A fight required both sides to believe something was still being negotiated. The night before the meeting, I wrote 3 sentences on a sheet of paper. Correct the false narrative in front of the relatives who had been brought into it. Make each person responsible for the part they actually played. Set clear conditions for any future relationship with Olivia. I read the list until I could remember it without looking. There was nothing about humiliating Mom. Nothing about making Ashley cry. Nothing about forcing Dad to choose sides. I didn't need them destroyed. I needed them unable to use me as the place where all their consequences disappeared. On Sunday afternoon, I dropped Olivia at Lauren's house and drove to my parents' neighborhood. My hands tightened around the steering wheel when their house came into view. I had driven there hundreds of times without thinking. Birthdays, Sunday dinners, babysitting pickups, Christmas mornings, emergencies, ordinary Tuesdays. That afternoon, my body remembered Dad pointing at the door before my mind could remind it that I had chosen to return. I parked anyway. The blue folder was in my bag. My printed calendar was under my arm. I walked up the same steps Olivia and I had walked down on Christmas night. But this time there was no frightened child gripping my coat and no one ordering me anywhere. Mom opened the door. Behind her, I could see relatives already seated in the living room. She looked at the folder, then at me. "Good," she said. "Now maybe we can finally talk about what's best for your daughter." I walked past her, reached the coffee table, and placed my calendar in the center of it. When I walked into my parents' house that Sunday, the first thing I noticed was that Patricia had arranged the chairs in a semicircle around the living room. There were only 6 relatives there, not the entire family, but it was enough to make her intention obvious. She wanted witnesses. She wanted me seated in the middle while everyone discussed what was supposedly wrong with my decisions. The last time I had stood in that room, Dad had pointed at the front door and told me to take Olivia and leave. This time, Olivia was safely with Lauren, and I had come back alone by choice. I carried the blue folder under one arm and my printed calendar in the other. Mom smiled when she saw me and said, "Good. Now maybe we can finally talk about what's best for your daughter." I put the calendar on the coffee table and took a seat. "Go ahead." Mom wasn't expecting that. She had probably prepared for me to interrupt, accuse her, or announce that the welfare concern had been closed without finding the safety problems described in the allegations. Instead, I let her speak. She told everyone I had become distant after accepting the promotion. She said I was cutting Olivia off from the family that had helped raise her. She reminded them that she and Dad had been there after my husband died, and described my move as an abrupt rejection of the support system Olivia had known her entire life. A few relatives nodded. One aunt said she understood why Mom was frightened. I didn't correct her. I wasn't there to convince every person in the room that Patricia was evil. I was there to correct facts. When Mom finished, she looked at me as if she had just presented a closing argument. "Do you understand why we're worried now?" she asked. I turned to Ashley instead. "On May 14th, did you believe I was unsafe around children?" Her face changed immediately. She glanced at Mom, then Dad. "What does that have to do with anything?" I opened the folder to the copied entry. "Your statement in this file says I was overwhelmed by work and unable to supervise Olivia consistently that night. Did you believe I was unsafe?" Ashley said she had believed I was overwhelmed. I placed the text she had sent me beside the entry, then her later confirmation of the childcare dates. "Both of your boys were at my house from 3:30 until after 9. If you believed I was unsafe with one child, why did you leave me with 3? No one answered for Ashley. That was unusual in my family. Normally, Mom would have jumped in before the silence had time to become uncomfortable, but she knew the dates were real. Ashley stared at the messages and finally said, "I didn't mean unsafe like that." I nodded. "That's the problem. In here, you did." She tried to explain that Mom had asked whether I seemed overwhelmed and that she had answered honestly. I told her I wasn't asking whether I had ever been tired. I was asking why the context disappeared when her description became evidence about my parenting. Ashley looked down. Mom started to say the file contained many examples, but I held up one hand. "We'll get there." I turned to June 2nd. "Mom, you described me as emotionally unstable and potentially unsafe to drive that day." Patricia crossed her arms. "You were extremely upset." I placed her morning text on the table. "At 7:58, you asked me to drive Dad to his cardiology appointment because you said I was the only person you trusted to make sure everything got handled." Dad shifted in his chair. I looked at him. "Was I the person who drove you downtown that morning?" He nodded reluctantly. "Yes." I asked whether I had driven dangerously, forgotten anything at the appointment, or seemed incapable of taking care of him. He said no. Mom interrupted that my mood had changed later. "Exactly," I said. I told you no when you wanted me to cross town again to solve another problem for Ashley. A disagreement that evening was rewritten as if I had been unstable all day. One of my uncles frowned at Patricia. Mom immediately said individual details could always be explained away, and that what mattered was the larger pattern. I had expected that answer. Then let's talk about the pattern. I removed the Christmas checklist. Mom recognized it before I said anything. Her expression hardened. I read the line about pushing the relocation issue and documenting my reaction if I became angry or left abruptly with Olivia. You told everyone Christmas was the night my behavior finally proved you had reason to worry. So why was my reaction already listed as something to document before I arrived? Dad spoke first. We knew the conversation might be difficult. I told him difficult conversations didn't bother me. Preparing to collect a specific reaction did. Then I played the short section of the video he had voluntarily sent Uncle Daniel after Christmas. Ashley's voice came first, asking what would happen if I simply left. Mom's voice followed. If she starts yelling, let her finish. Then Dad said, nobody turn that camera off. A little later came the line I hadn't heard until Daniel sent me the longer clip. If I left, they would document that too. The video ended, and the room stayed quiet. Mom's face reddened. We were protecting ourselves. I asked. From what? I hadn't arrived yet. She said I had been unpredictable for months. I reached into the folder one last time and removed the copy of Dad's personal notes from the family law consultation. Dad, is this your handwriting? He looked at it and said yes. I pointed to the line he had written after the attorney explained the situation based on the facts they had provided. No evidence of parental unfitness. Then I pointed to Mom's handwriting underneath it. Then we need to document it. Patricia leaned forward. That doesn't mean what you're trying to make it mean. I kept my voice level. I'm not saying an attorney told you to manufacture evidence. Your own notes show the opposite. You were told there was no evidence that I was an unfit parent. Instead of accepting that my move was legally my decision, ordinary complaints about pickups, missed dinners, work, and boundaries began appearing under headings like instability and isolation. I looked around the room before I continued. You didn't discover a pattern and then become concerned. You had a conclusion, and then you started changing the meaning of old events until they supported it. Dad immediately said, your mother started collecting those things. I only organized them. Mom turned on him so quickly that even Ashley looked surprised. You printed every page. Kenneth replied, because you asked me to. Don't make this sound like it was my idea. Patricia pointed toward Ashley. She was sending me screenshots because she was worried too. Ashley shook her head. You told me it was leverage. You said we needed something in case Jessica cut everyone off after the move. You never told me you were turning it into this. For the first time, the word "we" disappeared. Dad said Mom had exaggerated what the attorney told them. Ashley said Dad had been the one who assembled the file and put it behind the paperwork I was supposed to sign. Mom accused both of them of suddenly pretending they hadn't known she wanted me to stay. Kenneth said wanting me to stay was not the same as calling me an unfit mother. Ashley said she never believed Olivia was unsafe with me. Mom snapped. Then why did you send me anything? Ashley answered, because you kept telling me Jessica was going to leave us with nothing. Uncle Daniel finally spoke. He had been quiet through almost everything. Patricia, you didn't document a problem. You went looking for one. Mom stared at him as if he had betrayed her. My aunt beside him still looked uncomfortable and said she thought moving Olivia away from grandparents who loved her was unnecessarily harsh. I told her she was allowed to think that. I wasn't asking anyone to approve my move. That was the point. My relocation was not a family vote. I closed the folder and told them the move was still happening on January 24th. Then I explained what would have to change if any of them wanted a relationship with Olivia going forward. No conversations with her about custody or whether I was taking her away. No collecting material about my parenting behind my back. No using school access beyond what I specifically authorized. If someone had a genuine concern, they would bring it to me accurately instead of building a secret narrative around it. Contact would depend on respectful behavior, not on how much help anyone had given me years earlier. Mom's eyes filled with tears, but her voice stayed sharp. After everything we did for you, this is what we get? I looked at her and felt the old reflex rise in me. The urge to soften everything, so she wouldn't feel abandoned. I let it pass. You helped me when I needed you. I will always remember that. But it did not buy you the right to manufacture a version of me that was easier to control. I picked up my calendar and the folder. Dad started to say my name, but I didn't wait for him to finish. Christmas had ended with him ordering me out of that house. This time I walked out because I had decided the conversation was over. I was home less than an hour when my phone rang. Olivia was asleep upstairs, and the boxes for our move were stacked along the hallway. Dad's name appeared on the screen. I answered, expecting him to talk about Mom. Instead, he said, "Are you really taking me off Olivia's emergency list?" I looked toward the stairs and thought about every time access had been described as proof that my parents were practically raising my daughter. Dad waited for my answer while I realized the next boundary would determine whether anything had actually changed. Dad waited on the phone while I looked toward Olivia's room upstairs. "Yes," I said. "You're off the emergency list." He went quiet long enough that I could hear the television playing somewhere behind him. Then he asked if I really thought he would ever do anything to hurt Olivia. I told him that wasn't the standard anymore. The issue wasn't whether he loved her. The issue was what he had done with the access I had trusted him with. He had helped build a file that described normal grandparent involvement as evidence that he and Mom were practically raising my daughter, then used that same history to argue that moving Olivia away was somehow dangerous. I wasn't going to hand him the same access again and pretend nothing had happened. "I was trying to keep the family together," he said. "You keep saying that as if the family was something happening to you." He started to blame Mom, then stopped. Maybe he remembered what I had told him at the meeting. If he wanted a relationship with me, he had to talk about what he had done, not what Patricia had wanted him to do. "I shouldn't have put that file together," he said finally. It was the first clean admission I had heard from him. "No," I said, "you shouldn't have." He asked what he was supposed to do now. I told him that for once I wasn't going to solve that for him. If he wanted to rebuild trust, he could start by respecting the boundaries I had already given him. No conversations with Olivia about custody, no showing up at school, no collecting information about my parenting, and no using Mom as an excuse for his choices. He didn't like hearing it, but he didn't argue. The next few days were the quietest my phone had been in years. Ashley sent one message asking whether I still planned to move that Saturday. I said yes. She replied that she hoped it went smoothly. She didn't ask me to watch the boys, and I didn't offer. A week earlier, I would have noticed the distance and wondered whether I should repair it. This time, I let the silence belong to both of us. The consequences started appearing almost immediately. Ashley called Mom when her daycare closed unexpectedly, but Mom had an appointment and couldn't help. Ashley eventually paid for a backup sitter. Dad texted me a photograph of an insurance notice and asked what it meant. I replied with the customer service number printed at the bottom. He sent back, "That's it?" I told him yes. He was capable of making the call himself. Those were small things, but they showed me how much of my family's daily life had been built around the assumption that I would absorb inconvenience before anyone else had to feel it. I hadn't noticed the structure because I had been standing inside it. Patricia did not accept the boundaries quietly. She sent me several long messages about forgiveness, family loyalty, and how someday Olivia would resent me for taking away her grandparents. I answered once. I told her that Olivia was not being taken from anyone. Access would depend on behavior, and any future relationship would require her to stop discussing my fitness as a mother with my daughter or other relatives as though it were an open question. Mom replied, "So I have to confess to something I didn't do before I'm allowed to see my granddaughter?" I did not answer. She had reduced everything to a demand for confession, because that was easier than addressing the things I had actually asked for. I wasn't going to spend another month arguing about wording while my life waited. On January 24th, Lauren arrived early to help us load the last boxes. Olivia carried her stuffed rabbit to the car herself because she had decided he could not be trusted to ride in the moving truck. The townhouse was less than 3 hours away, but when we pulled out of our old neighborhood, it felt farther. I kept expecting some dramatic final phone call or a car in my rearview mirror. Nothing happened. We drove. We stopped for lunch. Olivia slept for 40 minutes with the rabbit under her chin. By late afternoon, we were standing in our new living room surrounded by boxes. The place was smaller than my old house, and the kitchen cabinets were an ugly shade of brown I already planned to change someday. Olivia didn't care. She ran upstairs, chose the wall where her paper snowflake would go, and announced that her bed needed to face the window. That night, after we ate takeout on the floor because I hadn't unpacked the table, Olivia asked if Grandma and Grandpa were mad because we had left. They're upset because they wanted us to stay, I told her. Do we have to go back? Not because anyone tells us to. She thought about that. Can my cousins still sleep over here someday? Maybe. When the grown-ups can be safe and honest with each other, that answer was enough for her. She went upstairs to arrange stuffed animals on her bed while I sat alone among the boxes and listened to her footsteps overhead. Over the next month, Dad followed the rules better than I expected. He called before contacting Olivia. He stopped sending me Mom's messages and stopped asking me to mediate between them. I did not put him back on the emergency list, but I did not cut him out of our lives either. Ashley and I spoke less often. Her childcare problems became hers to solve. Her marriage hit some tension when her husband learned how much she had contributed to the folder while still leaving their children with me, but that was not mine to manage. She apologized once without asking me to forgive her immediately. I told her I appreciated the apology and needed time. Mom was the last person to change, if she ever truly did. She refused my conditions for weeks because accepting them would have required admitting that love did not excuse control. I stopped measuring my peace by whether she understood. One evening, after Olivia had gone to bed, I opened my phone and saw the old shared family calendar. It was still filled with reminders I had created months earlier. Dad's appointments, Ashley's pickup times, Mom's errands, children's activities that were not mine. I deleted the calendar. Then I created a new one, Jessica and Olivia. For years, I thought being dependable meant being available whenever the people I loved needed me. What Christmas taught me was that there is a point where help stops being generosity and becomes an expectation, and an expectation can become a claim of ownership if you never challenge it. I didn't take my family away from them. I just stopped being the person they were allowed to build it on. You should never confuse family support with permanent control over your choices. Gratitude does not require you to surrender your boundaries, your future, or your child's well-being. When people use past favors to manipulate you, respond with facts, clear limits, and calm decisions. Protect what matters without becoming cruel. If this story reminded you to choose respect over guilt, subscribe to the channel for more family stories and hard-earned lessons.